Hello again, class. Today we're going to start a series of lectures on the Constitution. Now, in some respects, our entire course over the U.S. government is focused on the Constitution. After all, that's what sets up the government, sets up its rules, etc. But in these lectures, we're really going to just focus on more key terms of the Constitution, how it's structured, how it was put together, things like that. All right, so let's start there, and today we'll just talk about really some of the background of the Constitution and then key principles that we're going to find in the Constitution. All right, so there is a picture of the Constitution, and notice those three words, real giant on the page, we the people. All right, so that's sending a signal at the very front that this is going to be a government of the people. It's the people who are creating the Constitution, which in turn creates the government. Right, so that's always the fundamental principle when we're talking about the Constitution and the U.S. government, that the people are in charge of it. All right, so why do we have the Constitution we have today? Before we get into that, let's go back and talk about the Constitution that we had before the one we have today. All right, so when we talk about our Constitution that we use today, we write it with a capital C. That's the name, the Constitution. All right? The Constitution describes both what it is and its name, the Constitution, capital C. However, a Constitution is just any document that kind of sets forth the rules and limits for a government. All right, so the Constitution that we use today is not our first Constitution. That Constitution, and I'm talking about with a little c this time, all right, was called the Articles of Confederation. All right, so your 8th grade history memory should be tingling right now. All right, so under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government only had one branch of government, the legislative branch, and almost all power remained with the states. The national government couldn't even issue taxes under the Articles of Confederation, which kind of was a problem. Not just the taxation part, although that was certainly a big problem, but simply the federal government had no power. The federal government, or the national government under the Articles of Confederation, proves way too weak to function effectively. So, from May 1787 to September 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island didn't bother showing up, but the 12 other states arrived at Philadelphia for a meeting that today we call the Constitutional Convention. And these are some of the most famous people in American history, names you've heard: Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, people like that. These were the people in charge of writing the Constitution. And the essential question facing them was, how do we set up a strong national government while also letting states keep a lot of the power? Because, look, they understood that the people who went to this convention understood that the Articles of Confederation was too weak because it let the states have too much power. And they could basically just do whatever they wanted. And you had 13 separate states doing 13 separate things, and there was no unity, right? And there was no way to get everybody on the same page. So the people at the convention understood this, but who's not going to like creating a stronger federal government? Well, the states, obviously. If you have lots of power, you don't want to give it up and share it with someone, even if it's a good idea. So they understood that they couldn't take away all the power of the states, and many of them didn't even want to. But they understood that, they were creating a balancing act. They had to let the states keep enough power that the states would ultimately agree to the Constitution, but they had to give the national government enough power that could actually function, because it wasn't really functioning under the Articles of Confederation. So that, and like so many other things in the Constitutional Convention, is just a balancing act that they're going to have to sort through that summer. And so these delegates faced many, many issues and had to reach many compromises during their debates. Three of them I'm going to roughly mention. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time because these should have been dealt with in your 8th grade history class, so you should know these pretty well. So I just want to review. All right, the Great Compromise. This was the idea of how we're going to have a legislative branch, and the states are going to elect representatives to represent their states within this legislative branch, and they're going to write national laws. And the question was, how many representatives do the states get? Do they each get an equal number? And that's how they did it under the Articles of Confederation. Every state got one vote in the legislature. But big states like Virginia said, whoa, wait a minute, that's not fair. We have a lot more people than small states like New Jersey. We should get more representatives. And New Jersey said, look, we're all 13 separate states. We all have our own rights. We should all be treated equally. So there was a big problem because the small states and the big states wanted absolutely separate things. So a compromise was reached. It's called the Great Compromise. And what the drafters of the Constitution did is basically adopt both plans, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, so to speak. That's why our legislature, which we call the Congress, that's why Congress now is made up of 2 houses. You have the Senate, where every state gets 2 senators, elects 2 senators to go to the Senate. All right, so every state is basically treated equally in the Senate. But you also have a second house. It's called the House of Representatives. And there, the states elect different numbers. All right, there's a total of 435 representatives in the House of Representatives. Some states, like Rhode Island, like Montana, I believe, get 1 delegate. They elect 1 person to represent them in the House of Representatives. But a state like California has, I believe, roughly 55, either 53 or 55. Texas gets 36, though, because those are the 2 biggest states in terms of population. So they get the most members in the House of Representatives. And an aside, pay attention this year. The results of the 2020 census are going to come out soon. So we're going to see how the state's populations have changed in the past 10 years. And so they're going to redo a lot of the numbers for the states. So the plan is Texas is going to have a few more representatives in the coming years because their population has grown. Other states will probably lose a couple representatives because their population hasn't grown as much. Right, so pay attention to that here coming up. The second, and by far the most controversial and infamous, infamous meaning famous for a bad reason, the most controversial and infamous compromise during the Constitution was this 3/5 compromise. This is the Constitution, the part of the Constitution where the states are going to count their slaves, or they're only going to count 3/5 of their slaves in determining representation. All right. And it goes back to the Great Compromise. All right. States are getting, the more people in a state, the more representatives they get. Okay. So a state, has an incentive to have more people because that way they get more representatives in Congress. And so the debate was, well, how are you going to count all the slaves in the South? Because the South said, yeah, let's absolutely count our slaves. All right, take a place like South Carolina. You had more slaves than white people. All right, so South Carolina's representation in Congress, and therefore their power in Congress, was going to double or more if they got to count all their slaves. But the North said, well, wait a minute, that's unfair. That's unfair. Why should the South be rewarded, for trying to own other human beings? They shouldn't get to count their slaves because they certainly don't give them any voting rights or political rights of any kind. This isn't fair. All right, and so the way it would work, think about this: if you got a representative for every 100,000 people in your state, and a state like Virginia, had 500,000 slaves, Well, then they would get an extra 5 representatives that a state like New York that doesn't have slavery would have. And the northern states obviously did not think this was fair. So the compromise was, now you're going to count only 3/5 of those slaves. All right, so a place like Virginia, and by the way, I'm just making up these numbers, but a place like Virginia, if they had 500,000 slaves, well, they would get to count 300,000 of them, and therefore, under my hypothetical, they would get an extra 3 representatives instead of 5. Now, the South's still doing pretty well because they're still getting to count more than half, but they're not getting to count all of their slaves. Okay? So that's 3/5 compromise. And the last one we're going to talk about is the slave trade compromise. Most of the northern states had already outlawed the slave trade. And they were worried that, again, if a state could get more representatives in Congress simply by importing a whole lot of slaves from Africa, well, then the South would basically have all the power in the country. They'd have all the representatives because they could basically artificially grow their population just by capturing and importing more slaves to America. And the North didn't think that was right. But the South, states like South Carolina, and I think it was, the other one was Georgia, said, we're not going to agree to this Constitution in any form or fashion if you outlaw the slave trade. So the compromise reached here was that the slave trade could continue for 20 years, but the federal government was going to tax each incoming slave, and the federal government was going to regulate the slave trade. All right, so this is the first example of the federal government basically taking a nationwide action regarding slavery. Okay? So those were the big compromises. I know I didn't give you much to write down because this is review from your 8th grade history class, but I do hold you responsible for knowing all that information I just gave you. Okay, this is background. You don't have to write this part down. Just understand, many of the delegates weren't present when the Constitution was signed. All right, we started with at least 55, but remember, they were just sent to try to fix the Articles of Confederation, and they decided to rewrite a whole new Constitution. But this wasn't their job. All right, you know, they were lawyers or merchants or plantation owners or farmers. They all had, you know, obligations back home that they would often have to go back home and take care of and then come back to the convention and then leave again. So people were coming and going throughout the summer. And many delegates weren't around when it was time to sign the Constitution. It's ultimately going to be signed by 39 delegates on September 17th, 1787. But notably, 3 delegates, 2 of whom were from Virginia, Edmund Randolph and George Mason, and the 3rd from Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, refused to sign the Constitution at all. They didn't like the end result. They didn't like the balance of power that was struck within the Constitution. So they simply didn't sign it. And so out of the 42 people that were still there when it was time to sign it, only 39 actually signed. And in one of our other lectures in this series, we'll talk about the efforts to ratify the Constitution, get the states to agree to the Constitution. And we'll find out that although it's kind of hard for us to think about now, we understand that, well, of course, the Constitution sets up the country. It's the one that's still working, 230 years later. Everyone must have just loved it, thought it was a great idea at the time. But that wasn't true. There was a lot of opposition to it. All right, so now let's talk about the Constitution itself. I'm not going to go into all of the different articles and ramifications in this lecture, but I just want to give some overviews. All right, so we start with what's called the Preamble. That's a fancy word for introduction. The Preamble of the Constitution. It says, "We the people of the United States." Right? So again, they're trying to unite. You have these 13 states that were basically doing 13 different things under the Articles of Confederation. But you're going to try to unite them now into the United States. That's what the country's name means. Right? We're uniting these separate states. We, the people of the United States, in order to, so they're basically going to explain what they're trying to do or what they're trying to accomplish by this Constitution. form a more perfect union. Again, this idea of we have 13 states, we need to unify. They're going to form a more perfect union. They're going to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. That just means peace within the country. Tranquility means peace, and domestic means at home or within the country. All right, they're going to ensure or promise basic peace at home. They're going to provide for the common defense. No, I did not misspell the word defense there. That's how they still spell it in Britain, and how our founding fathers spelled the word defense with a C way back when, so I'm just using their spelling. The Constitution is going to promote the general welfare. That just sort of means we're going to try to create an environment where people can thrive, businesses can thrive, that sort of thing. And finally, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Y'all know who posterity is. We're their posterity. It means our descendants, the people who come after us. So in order to do these 6 things, we're going to basically ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So that's the preamble. That's the introduction. So as we learn about what's in the Constitution, and basically as we learn about anything having to do with the government for the rest of this class, and we go forward, keep in mind, does the government, as it's set up and functioning, is it doing one of these 6 things? Because this is what the government should be doing. Arguably, it probably shouldn't be doing much more than these 6 things, although we could, probably get into arguments as to whether this list was meant to be all-inclusive or not. But it certainly must be doing at least these 6 things. The government absolutely sort of has the mandate, the authority to be doing these 6 things, because that's what the Constitution says right off the bat. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in today's lecture are the 7 principles of government. If you go through and read the Constitution, especially once the Bill of Rights is added to it, you can find that there are basically 7 principles of the United States government. The first is popular sovereignty. This is pretty easy. It just means a government where the people rule. Popular refers to people, sovereignty means rule. Popular sovereignty is a government where the people rule. 2, republicanism. This just sort of describes how the people are going to rule. And the people here are going to rule by electing representatives. The people are going to elect representatives. That's how they're going to rule in our government. 3, federalism. And we'll have an entire series of lectures on federalism in the future. But for now, just understand federalism is where power is shared between a national or a federal government and the state and local governments. All right, so understand, and I know you already know this, but you may not have always thought about it in these terms. Remember, we have a national government that's based in Washington, D.C. We have a president, we have Congress, we have a Supreme Court, etc. But yet each of those states also has its own government. All right, so here in Texas, we have a governor, we have a state legislature, we have a state Supreme Court. We have all these, these 3 branches of government. Yeah, there's a national set of them in Washington, D.C., but each state has their own government in their capital. Okay, and this is federalism. The states share power with the federal government and vice versa. And it can be very complicated, it can be very controversial, so that's why we'll have a series of lectures on federalism later on. 4th, and this gets to, remember, recently we had a lecture on the Enlightenment. We talked about Charles Montesquieu and the spirit of laws and separation of powers. And it is true, we have separation of powers within our government. We have those 3 branches of government I just mentioned, and they each have their own authority. They each have their own power. All right, so they each have kind of their own lane to drive in, which brings us to the 5th principle, checks and balances. All right, they keep an eye out on the other one. All right, each branch is supposed to check, that means limit, and balance out each other's power. So in other words, each of the other branches gets to make sure that the other branches are continuing to drive in their own lane and not swerving and getting in, a different lane. All right? They each have a system of powers and responsibilities. Not a system, a series of powers and responsibilities. And the other branches basically get to check up on them, get to keep an eye on them and make sure that they're doing their duty, but not doing more than they should be doing. Okay, 6, limited government. Remember, we started with the Magna Carta that took away a little bit of the king's power over in London. And over time, over the next 560, 570 years, this is all going to be a trend of limiting government more and more until you get to the Constitution, where a system where government's power is not absolute. And you get to the 10th Amendment, which specifically says, hey, if it's not listed in the Constitution, then the federal government can't do it, and that power is reserved for the states or the people themselves. Okay, so the Constitution is meant to create a government of limited power. Our government can't just simply do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. Its power is limited. Finally, number 7, individual rights. The Constitution protects the rights of the people. Some of that's within the main body of the Constitution itself. Many of these are going to come about when we talk about the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. Those are changes. The first 10 changes to the Constitution are going to be called the Bill of Rights. And those really specify people's individual rights. But even within the main body of the Constitution, individual rights are protected as well. All right, so these are the 7 principles of the government. And so keep this idea in mind as we go forward with the rest of our series of lectures. Keep in mind, why are they trying to create the government? It was to get away from an ineffective government under the Articles of Confederation and give the federal government enough power to act while still maintaining this balance with the states. They're going to do those things listed in the Preamble, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, etc., etc. But they're going to take all those actions within these 7 principles: popular sovereignty, republicanism, federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government, and individual rights. So as we learn about what the specific terms of the Constitution says, keep in mind, are they making sure they're fulfilling all of these principles and kind of the promises of the Preamble? All right. Next time we will get into what the specific articles